Today's guest on the winning teams is a Diane Primo. She's this founder and CEO of Purpose Brand Agency. And she's had a fantastic and fascinating career before she actually set up Purpose Brand Agency. And I've asked her to kind of share that with us because it is important when, in terms of context and understanding why she's doing what she's doing, because she's doing it based on her own experience is somebody in the corporate world and has been very successful in the corporate world. We also talk about her book, Adopt, which is about scaling purpose in a divisive world. And she would explain why the title, and she'll also explain what adopt means. And there are, there's meaning behind the term adopt, and she will talk about that. But we also talk about the importance of purpose in a business, how you make it come alive, how you sustain it, and how you grow it and develop it over a period of time. And also how, we have from an organization perspective, but also from the team and the individual perspective, how we develop that kind of brand awareness from an individual perspective and how we manage it. And we'd also talk quite a bit about D&I. And as Diane says, D&I has failed in many, many ways. There are some metrics that you see being positive, but overall it has failed. And she talks about what can be done to actually reverse that and to actually make sure that it is having the impact that it should and truly deserves to have. But we also talk about, women in the corporate world and women of color in the corporate world. So it's a very wide-ranging interview. She's a great person to interview. She's got so much knowledge and expertise and data at her fingertips, and that it really is very, very fulsome and very valuable. And I think I've no doubt that you will just really enjoy it and be as engaged as I was in that. So sit back and enjoy the very interesting Diane Primo. Diane, thank you so much indeed for joining me here on the Winning Teams podcast. It's a great honor to have you here all the way from Chicago.
Hi, John. How are you? I understand you're in the south of France. Much better than my location.
Well, you have to come and visit. That's just the easy solution to that. So I'm not going to give a run through your bio because I won't do it credit, but I would love you to kind of give a quick run through because I think it is important. It's giving context and also kind of, how you came to kind of set up your own Purpose Brand Agency, the name of your organization, setting it up and where you are right now with that. So maybe that I think it's helpful because people know you're in this case, I think your background is actually really important.
That's a wonderful question, and I'll try to keep it very short. But I am CEO of a firm by the name of Purpose Brand. We are an award-winning public relations, really branding and digital content marketing agency. I think I'm the only African-American female of a CEO of a purpose-driven agency like the one we have created, which is really interesting. And just in short, it was really important for me to align our firm with my own personal values. I've spent my entire life probably in the corporate arena. And, I started off with a CPG company, Quaker Oats, and left as a GM. And then I went on to into telecommunications, Ameritech, which is I was president of product management. They were probably the biggest regional player in telecom. Then I went on to SBC, who purchased them, and I was president of product management and marketing for them. I was CMO for a technology reseller that's in the Fortune 500 CDW. I did a startup for Kleiner Perkins. There's something, right, for a year, and it failed, but I managed to get the partner to buy Kleiner out, and then I sort of went and started my own firm. I also have a side gig I'm really very proud of. My family started a center for the homeless, which is as people are aware, it's a global issue. It is a global crisis as it relates to homelessness. And we are the largest in the city of Chicago. focusing on homeless families. And we received Jeff Bezos' Leadership Award when he first set up his homeless fund. We're considered one of 5 best in class in the nation here.
Wow.
Which is very interesting. And we are also considered, highly innovative. We have, it's called the Primo Center. And we have since 2000 been really focused on metrics and recording what we do and improving what we do against metrics and tracking. And I think that's what's really made us so good. But that's my side hustle.
Okay. No, and the reason that I say, being honest, the reason I say, Dan, that your background is important for people to know is because when we talk about, sometimes when you talk about PR and marketing,
Oh, yeah.
people say, well, because you do have that what I would call hard business background,
Yep.
and very much kind of bottom line and P&L focus, and that is important in the context of the conversation we're having. I mean, I think what you're doing in the homeless is amazing. Can I ask you in terms of the book? Sorry, go ahead, Diane. You were going to say something.
One thing, maybe you were going to talk about it. I have 2 best-selling books. Okay.
Right.
One is Adapt, Scaling Purpose in a Divisive World. And the other is really kind of focuses on D&I, and it's called The All Report. And it really is about culture and what you really need to do culturally from diversity, equity, and inclusion, for those of you who are not completely familiar with those words. In Europe, you refer to it probably more as equity. Here we actually do refer to it as DE&I. The whole George Floyd moment was a big deal, and I'm sure you're very
absolutely,
aware of that.
absolutely.
We actually did consult with the legal team. They did come to us.
Right.
And very confidential, so I'm not going to talk about that.
No, sure. Okay, that's fine. I do want to talk about your book, Adopt, right?
Yeah.
And I'm just curious, before I get into it, you actually taught the scaling purpose in a divisive world, which is the subline to it.
Mm-hmm.
I was just curious why you actually put that subline to it.
Because we wanted to bring from the forefront that we are living in a world that's highly politicized, highly fragmented. And as a result, it really does make it challenging for a company that is purpose-driven to stay on purpose and with the intent without being challenged in some way. And what we are seeing increasingly is growing fragmentation, right? We've studied things by race, by gender, by generation, by politics. And what we see here, at least in America, we see a bleeding of, politics and cultural trend topics. Everything's being politicized to some level. And there's a fluidity across those 2 things that make it very challenging for a company who's purpose-driven, because they have to stay aligned with their purpose and they have to lean into it to be viewed as even trustworthy and intentional about what they're doing. So they have to speak up, most of them. They can't just sit back. And in a world that's highly divisive, it becomes challenging. It's really
absolutely.
Risk management.
It is, and I mean, and believe you me, that's not confined to the US. I mean, because you work outside of the US, that is a global problem. One of the question, and I really kind of want to kind of lean into this, Diane, is because I love the sort of work you do, and I love the message you have around purpose. One of the challenges, and I'm sure you've come across this many times, is that organizations go through, so okay, we've got to define our purpose, right? So we go through the exercise, and we maybe bring in, purpose brand agency to do it, and we do, you do great work, and we're all happy with it. But how do you make it then come alive? And rather than it being, yes, it's kind of intellectual or academic exercise that we've done. We've ticked a box. Yes, we've done something's work in our purpose. But how do you make it come alive, and how do you make it meaningful on a day-to-day basis?
That's a great question. It's very interesting because the book is actually called Adapt, ADAPT. But when we carefully named it that because it actually represents a framework for execution. right, and implementation. The A actually starts for assessment, and you really have to be very reflective internally and externally about the marketplace and what's going on with trends, cultural trends, trends that relate to improving the world, your own business. So the assessment phase of what you go through is really very, very important. Then you move over to the D, which is the definition phase. And what definition is really about is how do you define your purpose? It's not just a statement, which you just pointed out. And there's a lot of work that goes into just creating that statement. I don't want to undervalue that work because there's a big assessment phase in the creation of that statement. It's very, very important. But coming up with that statement, really, in that statement, what you're really doing is deciding how you're going to position yourself from a purpose standpoint. That's very important. So that is around your point of difference in terms of what makes you best and how are you going to take what you do best and improve the world in some way. And that literally is around purpose positioning. It looks a lot like brand positioning, but very, very different because it will sit over the corporation as a whole, right? And then within that definition phase, there's a framework for development, right? You want to look at your purpose position. You want to look at metrics in terms of how you're going to hold yourself accountable. So accountability is really important. You also then want to start thinking about an operational framework, and that has to do with, aligning your stakeholders. It has to do with incorporating it into your strategic development plan. It has to do with incorporating it into your impact plan, and then measurement. That's very, very important. So that is the D part of the book, right? A, which is the ADA part for ADAPT, has to do with amplification. And that really is about storytelling and creating the narrative around a purpose to make sure that your stakeholders engage, understand what you are operationalizing. I cannot stress this enough. It is really important for every company to do that. There's some research out there that says only 12% of companies that are doing purpose are remembered for doing it, right? And so that storytelling piece, authentic storytelling, don't make it up because you will get caught. We talk a little bit about this because consumers actually check, and they check in like a myriad of sources. They don't just go one place. They just kind of go all the way around, looking at your website, your materials. They're looking at where you invest, the philanthropies that you support. They're looking. So do not make it up. You will be outed, okay, in this day and world. Don't make it up, right? And so that application is really important, that the narrative, the storytelling part of it, aligning your stakeholders, alignment. I cannot say this, more strongly. Alignment on the assessment, at the assessment phase, in terms of the research, in terms of how they see you, what they see you being best at, where you need to really double down to correct some things that are non-purpose driven. But very important, that storytelling piece of it. So that's all about amplification of your message and allowing it to build on each other and allowing it to be integrated from a communication standpoint. And that includes your employees, do not think you can do purpose without doing it with your employees first, right? You don't want your employees to, one, not believe what you say and to talk about what you're doing, but more importantly, they are the catalyst for implementation. All companies that are purpose driven, it has to be implemented. Well, who's it going to be implemented by? Your employees. So you got to start with them. There's just no other place to start. So please, in that alignment phase, you need to have a very, very deep integration mechanism set up with employees. As you move through, so A is for assessment, D is for definition, A is for amplification. What's the P stand for? Performance. Do not think you can do this and not be held accountable, right? And I really want to spend some time talking about that because, you have the financial measures that we're all familiar with, revenue and how much we make and what, what our balance sheets look like, all of that. It's all but then you have non-financial measures that you're accountable for. And today, the easiest way to think about that is ESG in my mind, right? And so I look at ESG and I love it because to me, ESG is environmental, social, and governance, okay? And in investor circles, it's totally in vogue and it's all over the place now, right? Certainly, the principles of responsible investing have been, behind this with, thousands of signatories and billions of dollars in assets under management who have bought into this. But ESG is really about, what is material that you were doing in environmental, social, and governance. And if you're not doing it, how does that affect your risk profile?
Mhm.
So understanding what those non-financial measures are could represent your best insight for measuring some of the things that are softer in my mind around purpose that don't have to be, right? And so, and we also have diversity and inclusion in that. Why do we put it in the performance area? Let me ask you a question. Like, what does the world look like now? Okay.
Yeah.
I can tell you what the demographics look like in the US, right? They look like, people of color, and they look like women. Okay. Well, what's the percentage? That probably percentage alone is 70%. Only 30% is really white males, yet they control the C-suite. Okay, so how can you execute purpose and leave 70% of your talent base out? You just can't. So by its very nature, it says that you must include diversity and understand how you nurture and build a diverse workforce. It's sort of 101 if you're going to be a purpose-driven company in my mind. Now, the last part of ADAPT is for the T. And the T represents transcendence. And why do we spend so much time talking about that? It's because that none of these things are linear. Everything's going in and out. But the big grand prize here is to create a culture that's purpose-driven, right? Where it sort of takes on a life of its own, where whether you're looking or not, your employees are naturally doing it because it's what you have institutionalized and what you've built culturally. Right? You don't have to sit on top of it because it will naturally happen the way you want it to happen. The other part of the T for transcendence is, oh my gosh, impact, community impact, right? But thinking about your community is not just external, it's your employee community, it's your it's the communities that you reside in, but there's a sense of localness that you have to bring to it because people feel greater connection when they're thinking about where they are locally. If you start thinking about that from a purpose standpoint, it starts to look like something totally different. And of course, governance is in there. So I answered a very long question as one, it's not simple. Two, it is a ton of work, a ton of work. And three, don't enter into this unless you're serious. Because if you are not serious, you are going to be outed, and there are going to be a lot of people out there, and they call it, walk washing and greenwashing and all kinds of terms around it. You don't want to be in that segment.
Okay. But how do you sustain it once you've done all that work and you've kind of created that framework, you've put in your metrics, you've aligned your people, you've done that. How do you sustain it and make sure that it kind of is sustained 12 months, 18 months, 2 years from now? What are the things that you have to build into the process to actually, do that? Because, even, I mean, there would be an argument for saying, Diane, that even if you go back to the George Floyd, which was a catalyst for a lot of work that needed to be done and fast-tracked it. But, there are some would say that the impact of that has kind of diminished.
No,
right?
I agree with that.
So how do you sustain it?
That's a very good question. It's ongoing intervention. Let me just tell you what that intervention is. One, you got to build a culture around it. That's really important, because what culture really is it allows a company to extend things through their employees on its own, right? They kind of hold you accountable, right? It's built into the culture. It's institutionalized. And the second thing is intervention. If you think about it as an operational frameworks are revisited every year during the strategic planning process, the planning process. If you understand what the components are and what the impact measures are, those are things that live with you, okay? And that assessment phase, make sure you're mindful of updating it from an ongoing standpoint. But it's like anything else. No company runs on its own where we say, oh, let me just set a plan and I'm just going to let it go.
Sure.
There's all sorts of governance inside. And just like purpose needs governance, right? Same thing. It is about interventions and culture. And that's really important. And thank you for asking that question.
No, okay. You had a very interesting quote, and I would just like you to kind of elaborate on a little bit. You say that the purpose of business is the business of purpose. Think about it. No statement could be simpler, yet also more complicated and difficult to implement. I thought that was a great sentence. I'm not sure that I fully understand it, so I'd love to hear your take on that.
Yeah. My take on it is that, you know, if you kind of step back and you think about it, and you think about particularly the public's expectations around a company, right? There really isn't any other option in my mind, because a company has to be, you know, their purpose has to be, their business has to be purpose related, because there are not any other options when you look at the world and what's happening. Great examples of this are, and then this is I'm going for the low-hanging fruit, right? And low-hanging fruit is, you know, if there's a hurricane, and a big hurricane, there is business interruption, everything's knocked out, right? During the George Floyd protests, okay, interruption, COVID-19, okay, a global pandemic, right? We're all home. Everything's thrown up in the air, right? And if you look at that, it was closely related to how we manage our environment. And we were entrenching on animals' normal terrain from an environmental standpoint, which moved them closer to us, which enabled the virus to spread, right? So all of these things are interdependent, right? And we forget about the interdependence of this. And if you believe that there is interdependence, which we firmly do, you have to be purpose driven. You just can't allow the world to go in a downward spiral. You've got to intervene. It's in your best business interest to do so. And we firmly believe that. And we think our clients do too. More importantly, we think that the world believes it. When we did the ADAPT book, we you know, suggested that this was the operational model, the one we were putting out. And the companies that participated with us agreed in that model, and they said, okay, we'll allow you to use our content. So Microsoft, Nike, maybe Chipotle, Warby Parker, HPE, JP Morgan Chase, Rockefeller Foundation gave us content. That was a wow. Rockefeller Foundation is a wow. And, you know, if you want to hear a little bit more about what they said, I'd be happy to tell you, but they were amazing for us.
Okay. Just curious, because you mentioned COVID, you mentioned COVID there, and it just kind of sparked a thought in my mind. When you're working with organizations to really embed the whole kind of purpose-driven organization, embedding that into the organization, what impact did COVID have, where suddenly everybody, you know, I mean, we had everybody in the office, now we suddenly got everybody at home, and now we're kind of struggling to find, everybody is struggling to find exactly what they have. But what impact did it have, or did it have any impact, when suddenly people got dispersed and were working from home rather than being in the office, in the work, specifically in the work around really embedding their purpose-driven culture?
You know, it was really interesting during the time, because there were a lot of articles that came out and said, we're not so sure about this purpose stuff. You know, like, is this going to be a fad? Like, is it going to just disappear during this time? What was very interesting is that companies that were purpose-driven leaned into it, and they utilized it in that moment to create programs that either cared for others, you know, where they took their whole manufacturing facilities and they retooled them so they could make masks or hand sanitizer or something of that nature. Or they created programs for their employees to better connect them to things that were important to them. Okay, restaurants put employees out of business. I mean, COVID literally shut them down, right? And entities were springing up saying, let me kind of create an emergency place for these employees to access funding and help, right? What is it, Feeding America? They kind of hit the $1 billion mark during that time period. They had people like Amazon calling them saying, hey, I got like this much money, right? I'm going to give it to you and move it through your system within 3 to 4 days to help people, right? People just really rose to the occasion in ways that I think none of us could possibly have imagined. And then you saw clients leaning in from a culture standpoint saying, you know what? Culture right now is really more important than ever. Let me have like our monthly team meeting. Let me have daily check-ins. I mean, really going out of their way to really lean in and use that moment to connect employees in a bigger way. Now, having said that, coming out of it, we're looking at a workforce that's fundamentally different, right? And everybody has to deal with that because during that moment, everybody leaned in. And now we're left with something that's different, right?
Yeah, and it's and people are trying to find out what is the new norm, what is the right balance, what is the kind of hybrid, what's the model, and it is a struggle, to be fair.
The new norm is that there is not a norm, right? Because I mean, the other reason that we named the book Adapt is not only because of the framework, is because we think purpose makes you more adaptable. Okay. And we think that the COVID moment has proven that. We also asked companies for all of their, what each of them did during the COVID moment. So that's a very important chapter to read in the transcendence area. You'll get some really interesting learnings from that. But what we really believe is that purpose does make you adaptable because it forces you to self-reflect. That assessment that is there. You need to do that if you're a purpose-driven company on an ongoing basis because people's beliefs change, what they value change, what works changes. We find out new things that are harming us in different ways. So that assessment phase is really, really important, and it never goes away.
Yeah, and of course it also, I'm sure it also changes because organizations change. So you're not talking about something that is static. Can I ask you a question which I'm really interested in from your perspective? And I mean, you've worked in large organizations, you consult with large organizations, and one of the things that I work with some large organizations globally as well. And when you talk about the brand story of an organization, and sometimes that brand story can seem very far away to the brand story for the team so how important is it for the team to identify their own brand story? I accept it's got to be a subset of the overall, but identifying what it means to that team, or is that something that's important?
No, I think it's very important. So what you're trying to do, remember I talked about the idea of localness, right?
Yes.
That for us, in the transcendence page, there's this community a piece that is around sort of like your community, your zip code, your employees, et cetera, right? And we know that small generally means greater engagement. Right? So you have to take that bigger brand identity story, the bigger manifesto around purpose, and you've got to let the small groups and teams and departments and sub-departments say, what does this mean for us? And how are we going to bring it to reality, right? And that's a very important part of the discussion and the alignment process, right? Because you want to let them touch it and feel it and understand how they personally can bring that to life. I just can't stress that enough. So thank you for that. That is really true.
So can I tell you, we're talking about the kind of the organization brand story. We're talking about the team brand story. But let's also talk about personal branding within the corporate world. And I mean, you talked about it, and I do want to come back to this thing about kind of the corporate world and it still being a men's club and a white men's club. But I want to come back to that. But let me just kind of zone in on personal branding, because when I'm coaching senior executives, I do talk to them about their own personal branding. What does it look like? How do people describe you? And because you're going to have a branding. Right? It's better if you have one that you like, right?
Absolutely.
but how important is that in the corporate world? And also, how do you avoid it kind of appearing like it's too self-serving?
Yeah. I think that's also a very good question. I would say two things about that. We have something that we refer to as brand slate, and it's the talk we give, particularly to females and diverse populations, because they don't think in those terms. If you don't start to define your brand slate, what your brand really is, it is whatever odd people think it is, right? So you need to also think about your own, personal branding, and part of your personal branding for me, because we talk about the move from brand positioning to purpose positioning, is for you to determine what your own purpose is and to kind of build it around that, right? We feel that's very important, because if you are centered and you understand that and you manage what's around you, then you can indeed, I want to say this is a weird word, infect positively others around you. Okay. You can actually help others and steer other people in that same direction. So you actually become a catalyst for others within corporations. And if you think about, if you have all of these individuals that are really centered, because being around people who are centered is a very sort of wonderful and positive and actually calming thing, to be honest with you, right? And we all enjoy them, but if you have you start creating clusters and cohorts of them, they affect each other in such a positive way, because they're centered, they have a purpose, they understand how their brand relates to the world, they understand how their brand relates to others and others in divisions, and etc. So we absolutely believe in that. And one other thing I'd give you some advice on is, if people overseas should look at a company called Bonfire. And Bonfire really kind of starts with, it's designed for middle management, for women who are really want to travel with an organization, but that their whole premise is that if I can create a woman who's really clear in their purpose, and I can give them power and agency to really affect much bigger things within the company. And people who go through this program, the companies rave about the women who come back. Okay. And it's literally called Bonfire. And it's about creating sparks of change within a corporation in the world. And the people who go through the program love it. And the companies who actually have the women come back will love it. And it's a company out of Chicago, formed by a Northwestern professor with some pretty prestigious, anonymous investors.
Okay. I hope I'm not misquoting you, but and please tell me if I am misquoting you, but I think you said that DE&I has failed. Am I misquoting? I'm not misquoting you, obviously, then.
No,
okay,
no.
so what do you mean by that? And I'm curious why you think it's failed, but I'm also curious as to what you think we should be doing about that, because we can't allow it fail.
Right. Thank you for asking that. I think it has failed. Okay, I think that the term D&I came into vogue, believe it or not, in 1984. Okay, and if you were in a corporation, many of the same issues today were there in 84, and that's why they kind of created it. I also saw a stat, something like I think it's $8 billion has been spent on D&I consultants. I think that was something that MIT looked at in like 2000. Heaven knows how much more money has been spent on it, right? Yet when you look at the numbers, you don't see a lot of changes, especially for Blacks. You don't. Okay, women have performed much better and maybe have become the face of diversity at the expense of everybody else, right? But the numbers aren't there. During George Floyd, we saw a flux because people were, coming up because people started changing and kind of leaning into their, really looking at their senior suites and really kind of spending some time thinking about it, right? but we find the same old things out there, like, okay, I can't find them. You know, I just can't find the companies. I can't find the people. You know, they can't be groomed fast enough. All those things tend to plague. Okay, so what can you do about it, right? What you can do about it is intervention. I'm really big on intervention. Okay, this is not something that you can not stay on top of. Adding to that, I want to say one other thing. We're at an all-time high for here. We have diversity and inclusion officers. We put them in place, right? And so that's gone up like 1,000% or something like that. I think I saw on LinkedIn it had gone up 500%. That was like a couple of years ago in terms of them hiring people in. But you're hiring people in, but you're not giving any power. Okay. And the other thing is that you know, you have to fund it. You have to give them power. It's not about unbiased training. What it's about is about, you know, giving people opportunity. It's about cross-training them. It's about, you know, making sure that the good ones are perceived to be on loan. They're not, and they can be moved around at any point to advance the organization as a whole, as opposed to a manager seeing them as fulfilling their kind of my objectives, right?
Right, yeah.
And so
because that can become tokenism as well,
oh, totally.
which is the worst thing on it. My understanding is, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, Diane, but my understanding is that you kind of create a workshop to actually really future-proof D&I is that correct, in organizations? So that is something that you do. So just maybe explain what that is and what that does and what the impact is.
So there are a lot of programs out there for organizations, right? But so my advice to organizations is you need to think about how to relook at all of your processes, okay? And relook at those processes to rebuild them so it becomes, they are equity centered in design. I think that's really important, right? The workshop you were referring to that we do is for Marcom people, for marketing and communications people, right?
Yeah.
Because they're a part of this. What we found is, because we're marketing people, is that there are a gazillion cases out there where someone's gotten out to the marketplace and then like somebody said, oh my gosh, that campaign is like racist, you know, like we're gonna close it down, like Pepsi, right? We're gonna close that campaign down, right? The truth is that marketing and communications people really aren't trained. And why aren't they trained for things like this? For the same reason that senior management isn't trained, okay?
Yeah.
It's about lived experience. And so for most of us, out in the corporate world at the executive level, they've grown up in segregated neighborhoods. They've gone to segregated schools. They go into segregated companies, right? They don't have any experience really at D&I when they come in. They don't really have any experience. Let's just call a spade, right? Yet they've said, okay, now you guys have to go and you got to fix this D&I thing, right? Well, it's not fixed. Well, no wonder it's not fixed, right? Lived experience, they don't have it. And so what we try to do in the marketing side and the communication side, we stand up a full day workshop. And the workshop really is designed to go through, we probably go through 125 case studies about failure. We talk about divisions in language. What does the new landscape look like even from a pronoun standpoint? Still marketers get confused around that, believe it or not, right? We look at all of it together. We take those case studies and we categorize them into areas with things for them to look at. So they're left with a one-page checklist where they understand content, context, all of the areas and what the issues are, because we've taken all of this and we packaged it together from all the failures in the marketplace, and also talking to some Fortune 500 companies about what they've learned. And so it culminates in that. We found it to be highly useful. We use it internally ourselves, right? Somebody said, well, somebody had raised their hand and said, you can't do that. I loved it. Like, you can't do that. And here's why. And they used that as an example. It got pulled off the table immediately, right?
Yeah.
And so this is something that I don't think marketing and communications people are trained on. And we need to do it before and earlier in recognition that they don't have those experiences. And we don't just do it for Black, Hispanic example. There's examples around elders. I mean, just about everything you can imagine.
Yeah.
If people just aren't thinking as they're doing. Like this is going to affect some subsegment of the population, and they're going to have something to say. And by the way, they're going to have a lot to say, not a little bit. So,
well, I mean, just to validate your point, when the whole George Floyd thing happened, and I decided that I was going to go and get accredited as a D&I consultant. Not that I actually wanted to practice as one, but I actually wanted to educate myself, right?
Absolutely.
And I have to say, Diane, that the abiding reflection was that I thought I knew a bit, and I realized I knew nothing.
Yeah,
right. And because the background where I came from, my lived experience didn't really impact, right? And it really was a case of, well, I thought I knew a little, but then I actually realized I knew a lot less than a little. And it was very informative. But can I go back to something you said earlier on? And by the way, I appreciate I'm taking up more of your time than I said, but this is really interesting. That you've had a very successful career in the corporate world. Before you went and set up your Purpose Brand agency. But I said earlier on, it's still essentially a boys' club, and it's still essentially a white boys' club, right? So as a woman of color, how did you navigate that? And what do you advise women, and not necessarily women of color, but women, to how they navigate their careers within the corporate world now?
Well, that's a really good question. The first, be competent. Okay, be beyond competent. That's the first piece of advice that I would give you, right? The second is networks are important. I think that, and I was one of those women, right? I had been brought up by a single mother, and what she taught me is the value of an education, okay? And do your best, and you will be rewarded. But she wasn't familiar with the world as a whole. She was familiar with education. This is really important. This is something that was denied to us. You need this, right? And so I thought that, you got the good grades, et cetera, and people would recognize it. No, okay. You really have to build that network, right? And I had a white male pull me aside and said, hey, you're talented, but you're doing it all wrong, right? This thing about networks for you, really important. Brand, it's about building your brand, right? Like relating, connecting to people, right? Very, very important. And, speaking, advocating for yourself when you need to, all that stuff that I didn't know, it was like a little secret in my ear, right? That allowed me to start leaning in and learning more, et cetera. The other piece, I have a few good mentors along the way, right? I had one of them who wanted to build an organization. He liked controversy. There's something, right? Like he wanted to have leaders that were willing to say, that's not right. If you are a person of color, people don't like to hear it sometimes, that's not right, but he encouraged you to be your authentic self. And he also opened up the door for others to listen to you, right? And I was in an organization that was exactly the opposite. Okay, but I'll tell you, being in an organization like that versus another, completely different experiences, and important, right? To recognize that for people who are of color, they need a CEO who's at the top, because it's intervention, who actually believes in it. That's really important. And so when we talk about intervention, a CEO is really important to the success of diversity within a company. Because if you let other people have it, do it, those lived experiences are not going to translate into results. Okay, like one of the pieces of research that we did, I thought was the most fascinating, is we looked at probably 60 or 70 different D&I practices or programs, right? And one of them was testing, testing people when they came in. And we looked at it by white male, women, Blacks, Asians, Hispanics, LGBTQIA, we looked even disabled, right? And what we found was that the things that rose to the top, cross-training, giving them opportunity, taking some risk, diversity slates that were mandated, okay? Looking at people differently when you came to the opportunity for opportunities where they were really kind of looked at as high potential. What are you doing? Give them chances. The stuff that was the bottom was things like unbiased training. Like everybody thought that stuff didn't work when you looked at diverse groups. Now, the one outlier was we got to the very top, everybody was aligned on those things that worked. But there's one thing that was really out of alignment. White males felt that testing would really help, like way over. We need to be tested. I said, I don't know what that means. Does that mean that they think, because this is for diverse audiences, right? Like all diverse audiences, that we're not smart enough? What does that mean? You know?
Right, yeah.
It was really kind of a like, because it was almost like, because we haven't been successful, there must be some accountability for the person who is coming in, and this is the way that we can even things out. But we question people in such a way that this whole battery of testing so fast and so rapid, where we think that one just kind of got through. And if they had looked at it again and had time, they probably would have changed their answer. But it was very interesting. And I don't know if I've answered your question, but in corporate America, I would say that it really is about cross-training. It's about giving people opportunities, okay? If you see that spark, give them an opportunity to do something great. Support them. Know that interventions are going to be important.
But I think your advice too, as well, Diane, is that, you know, it is about that networking, because it's not, I mean, okay, competency is a given, but it's not just enough. It's not just say, I do good work, I will get, and that's true of anyone, right? But really, but it's certainly true for, it's most definitely true for women, and probably even more so for women of color. Diane, this has been a fascinating conversation, and I really appreciate it. And before, I'm sure people want to get in touch with you. Before we actually do that, we'll put everything in the show notes, but I'll get you to explain in a minute. 2 questions I ask everybody, and I'm curious to ask you these 2 questions. One is a book other than your own that's had an impact upon you. And what's the book and what was the impact?
Net Positive by Paul Pollan. He wrote a book about purpose. I followed him from the beginning. I actually mentioned him in my own book, right? Because I think for corporate America, he really was a catalyst. I recommend that book to everyone. It is a book for a Fortune 500 company, really getting inside, talking about, you know, the UN and its impact and what you can do at a higher level. To me, it is not necessarily for that, you know, company that's under that, because they're not going to have that kind of intense exposure. If you're a global company, that's the book you need to read. It is absolutely fabulous. And oh, by the way, he believes it. Right, he is. He's the previous. He ran Unilever for 10, 12 years, and he is the real deal.
Okay, that's an interesting one. That's one that I haven't come across before. Daily rituals, do you have them? What are they and how do they serve you?
Wonderful. I work out every day, every single day. I don't think I've ever missed a day.
Wow.
I will get up. I used to run every day until I fell and broke my wrist. And I slowed it down to walking and made it inside. But I will get up and I will do something every day. And even if it's a walk, even if I can't do my full thing, I'll figure out a way to do a half an hour. I won't drive, I'll walk. But working out is part of my daily ritual. The second thing is that I try to do something where I will learn a bit, right? We have a newsletter that's about to come out in the quarter, and one of the things we do is we call it our trend newsletter, because we think it's important to stay on top of trends. We kind of go through and do sort of aggregate things. Like if you go to our website, it's purposebrand.com. In our blog session, we've taken all the D&I reports that have been published by Fortune 500 companies. We put them all together for people. We believe that resources are important. All the ESG reports that are tagged ESG, they're all in one spot for you to access really easily, right? All the corporate purpose statements. We've scrubbed Fortune 500 companies. We have them all in one place, right? But stimulation, mental stimulation is critical, right? It keeps you on the edge, it keeps you active, it keeps you involved, but more importantly, allows you to connect the dots, allows you to see white spaces where others can't, because you know this and this and this. Oh, well, what if I put this together, right? That idea about ongoing learning, I think is so very, very important.
I agree with that. I think that, I always say to people that the day you stop being curious is the day that you start a very slow death.
That is really true.
And I think that's true. Diane, it's been fantastic to have this conversation. I've really enjoyed it. It's been very insightful, very interesting. Where can people get in touch with you? I know that the website you mentioned, I mention it again, and also how people can reach you.
dprimo@purposebrand.com. I'm giving you my direct email, right? That's dprimo@purposebrand.com. If you go to our website, purposebrand.com, there is a, you could, in our contact us page, you can contact us. And that is really how you can reach us.
I'd also say that on your website, and I would encourage people to go there because there's a ton of resources on your website. And there really is a ton of resources. So I really would encourage anybody just to go and explore and have a good look around it, because there is a lot of resources there. But Diane, thank you so much for joining us today on the Winning Teams. It's been a pleasure.
It's such a pleasure. Thank you, John.